I used to believe that silence was kindness, that if I didn't complain, didn't push, didn't make myself too much, everything would stay peaceful. Families survive on peace, don't they? That's what I told myself for years. But peace, I learned, can also mean disappearing. My name is Emily. I'm 70 years old, and the night everything changed didn't begin like anything special. It started with roasted chicken, soft music playing in the background, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, I still belonged. My son Daniel had invited a few of his coworkers over for dinner. It wasn't unusual. He liked to host, to show that he had built something respectable, career, house, family. And I was part of that image. Or at least I thought I was. I had spent the entire day cooking. My hands weren't what they used to be. Arthritis had settled into my fingers like an unwelcome tenant that refused to leave. Still, I chopped vegetables slowly, carefully. I seasoned everything the way Daniel liked since he was a boy. I even baked a pie from scratch, though standing that long made my back ache. I wanted him to be proud of me. By the time guests arrived, the house smelled warm and inviting. Laughter filled the living room, glasses clinked, voices overlapped. I stood near the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching it all unfold. It used to be my house. That thought came quietly, almost shyly, like something I wasn't supposed to say out loud, even in my own mind. "Mom, can you bring the drinks?" Daniel called without looking at me. "Of course," I said quickly, already moving. His wife, Claire, stood at the counter scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up as I passed her. "Claire, could you help me carry these?" I asked gently. She sighed, barely glancing at me. "In a second." We both knew that meant no. So I carried everything myself. Slowly, carefully, hoping I wouldn't drop anything. At the table, conversations flowed easily, but not around me. Around me meant I would have been included. Instead, it flowed past me, like I was a chair or a shadow. Daniel talked about work. His boss laughed loudly. Claire chimed in at just the right moments, her voice bright and practiced. The children were upstairs, glued to their screens, barely aware there were guests in the house. And I sat there, smiling when someone glanced my way, nodding when it seemed appropriate, speaking only when spoken to. Invisible but still useful. It happened toward the end of dinner. One of Daniel's coworkers, a woman with sharp eyes and a polite smile, turned to me. "So, Emily," she said, "what do you usually do during the day?" It was a simple question, a normal one. I opened my mouth to answer, but I never got the chance. Claire laughed lightly, waving her hand as if dismissing something trivial. "Oh, Emily mostly just has appointments," she said. "Doctors, pharmacies, you know how it is." There was something in her tone that made my stomach tighten. She leaned back in her chair, smiling at the others. "Honestly, if we tracked it, I'm pretty sure half our monthly expenses are her medications." A couple of people chuckled awkwardly, and then she added almost casually, "It's like having an extra bill that never goes away." The room didn't go silent, but it changed. The air shifted. The laughter thinned. Someone cleared their throat, and I felt something inside me crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, clean break. I looked down at my plate. I hadn't eaten much. My appetite had disappeared somewhere between her first sentence and the last. I waited. I don't know why, but I waited for Daniel to say something. Anything. A joke to soften it. A correction. A simple, "That's not true." But he didn't. He gave a small, uncomfortable laugh and reached for his glass. Then he changed the subject. Just like that. As if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't just been reduced to a cost. That night, I lay awake in my room. The room at the end of the hallway, the smallest one. The one that used to be a storage space before I moved in temporarily. Temporary had turned into years. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over again. Not just her words, but his silence. That was the part that hurt the most. Claire's cruelty had edges, yes, but Daniel's silence had weight. It pressed down on my chest until it was hard to breathe. I thought about everything. The years I had worked double shifts after my husband died. The nights I stayed up helping Daniel with homework. The sacrifices that didn't feel like sacrifices at the time because that's what love does. It gives without counting. And yet here I was. Counted. Measured. Priced. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, something inside me settled. Not anger. Not sadness. Something colder. Clearer. Understanding. When I woke up, the house was already alive with noise. Doors opening and closing. Footsteps rushing. Claire calling out instructions. Daniel looking for his keys. Life moving forward unchanged. No one knocked on my door. No one mentioned last night. No one apologized. It was as if it had never happened. But it had. And I couldn't unhear it. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I had been humiliated just hours before. Sunlight streamed through the window. Everything looked normal. But I wasn't. Memories began to line up, one after another, like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to assemble. The time Claire reorganized the kitchen and told me not to confuse things. The way Daniel stopped asking my opinion on anything. The subtle comments about my old habits. The suggestion, so casually made, that I might be more comfortable in the basement. I had ignored all of it. Because I didn't want to be difficult. Because I didn't want to lose my place in the family. But sitting there, holding that warm cup between trembling hands, I finally saw the truth. I didn't have a place. I was just there. And even that felt temporary. I set the cup down slowly. "I'm not done yet," I whispered to myself. The words sounded strange, almost unfamiliar, but they felt right. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what my family needed. I was thinking about what I needed. And that changed everything. The decision didn't come with drama. No tears, no slammed doors, no long speeches whispered into empty rooms. It arrived quietly, like a realization that had been waiting patiently for years. The morning after that dinner, I moved through the house the same way I always did, careful, unobtrusive, invisible. I washed my cup, wiped the counter, straightened a chair that no one would notice had been out of place. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside me, something had settled with a kind of final clarity I had never felt before. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns, demands attention. What I felt was colder, steadier. I understood my position in that house now, and once you truly understand something, you can't pretend otherwise. By late morning, the house was empty. Daniel and Claire had left for work, the children were at school, and the silence that remained felt different from the one I had grown used to. It wasn't heavy or lonely, it was open. I sat down in the living room and looked around slowly, letting my eyes rest on things I had stopped seeing. The bookshelf I had assembled years ago, now filled with things I didn't recognize. The couch I had picked, reupholstered in a color I would never have chosen. The framed photos, family pictures where I stood slightly off to the side, smiling but somehow separate. I realized then that my life had been gradually edited, piece by piece, until only a faint outline of me remained. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet where I kept my coat. On the top shelf, hidden behind an old box of winter scarves, was something Daniel didn't know about. A small envelope. Inside it, the last remaining document from a decision I had made years ago, one I barely remembered making at the time. When I transferred the house into Daniel's name, my lawyer had insisted on adding a condition. I had almost laughed it off back then, trusting my son completely. But I hadn't removed it either. My consent was still required for any sale or major transfer. At the time, it felt unnecessary. Now, it felt like the only thing that still belonged to me. I held the paper in my hands for a long moment. My fingers didn't tremble this time. Then I went back to the kitchen, picked up my phone, and dialed a number I had searched for weeks ago but never had the courage to call. The line rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. I introduced myself simply. My voice sounded steady, almost detached, as if I were talking about someone else's life. I'd like to discuss selling a property, I said. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a series of practical questions. Address. Ownership details. Timeline. I answered all of them without hesitation. When the call ended, I placed the phone down and sat very still, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. That was it. The first step had been taken, and strangely, I didn't feel fear. I felt relief. The meeting with the agent happened the next day. I told Daniel I had a doctor's appointment, which wasn't entirely a lie, just not the kind he would expect. The agent, Mr. Harris, was younger than I imagined, with a polite smile that didn't quite hide his curiosity. He looked at me carefully as we sat in a small office that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Are you sure you want to proceed? He asked gently after reviewing the documents. This kind of decision usually involves the whole family. I met his gaze without flinching. It involves me, I said. That's enough. Something in my tone must have convinced him, because he nodded and began outlining the process. The market was strong. The house would likely sell quickly. Very quickly. Within a week, he said, if priced correctly. When I left his office, the world looked sharper, more defined. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer. I walked slower than usual, noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The rhythm of people passing by, the crispness of the air, the simple fact that I could choose where to go next. That feeling stayed with me when I returned to the house. I stepped inside and paused, letting the familiar space settle around me one last time, though I didn't fully realize it then. For the next few days, I lived as I always had. I cooked. I cleaned. I listened to Claire talk about her day without really hearing her. I nodded when Daniel spoke about work. But beneath all of it, I carried a secret that made everything feel distant, almost unreal. Packing was the hardest part, not because there was so much to take, but because there wasn't. Decades of life reduced to a few boxes forced me to confront something painful. Most of what filled that house was no longer mine, not really.
He chose carefully.
Old photo albums, only the ones from before things started to change. A few pieces of jewelry with memories attached to them. A watch that had belonged to my husband. A quilt my mother had made long before Daniel was born. Everything else, I left behind without regret. Objects lose their meaning when the place they belong to no longer feels like home. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, Daniel mentioned casually that they would be away for the weekend. A short trip for the children, something about a school event in another city. I listened quietly, keeping my expression neutral, though my heart had already begun to race. This was the moment, the window I needed. That sounds nice, I said, offering a small smile. I'll be here when you get back. The words felt strange even as I said them, but neither he nor Claire noticed. Friday morning arrived with a strange calm. I watched them leave, standing by the window as their car disappeared down the street. I didn't move for several minutes after that. The house felt hollow without their noise, but not in a painful way. In a freeing way. Then I picked up the phone and made one more call, the moving company. They arrived faster than I expected, two young men who treated me with a quiet respect that felt unfamiliar. They didn't ask unnecessary questions. They simply carried the boxes I had prepared, piece by piece, until my entire life fit into the back of a small truck. When they asked if that was everything, I looked around slowly. The walls, the furniture, the silence. Yes, I said. And for the first time, I meant it completely. Before leaving, I went into the kitchen one last time. I placed an envelope on the table, right where Daniel would see it. Inside was a short note, nothing dramatic, nothing cruel. Just the truth, stripped down to its simplest form. That I had given everything I could. That I needed to live the rest of my life for myself. That they shouldn't try to find me. I didn't know if they would understand. I wasn't sure I cared anymore. As I stepped outside, The air felt different, lighter. The driver loaded my last suitcase into the car and asked for the address. I gave it without hesitation. A small apartment near the water, in a place where no one knew me, where I could exist without being defined by what I provided. I didn't look back, not because I was trying to be strong, but because I no longer needed to. Some chapters don't require a final glance. They end the moment you choose to walk away. And for the first time in years, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking towards something. The first night in my new apartment was quieter than anything I had ever experienced, but it wasn't the kind of silence that presses on your chest. It breathed with me. The soft sound of waves outside the window replaced the distant noise of traffic and the constant movement of a house that had never really felt like mine. I stood in the middle of the living room for a long time, not unpacking, not sitting, just existing. The space was small, modest, almost bare. But every inch of it belonged to me. That realization alone made it feel larger than any home I had lived in before. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that doesn't come from exhaustion but from release. No one called my name. No one needed anything. No footsteps outside my door. No tension lingering in the air. When I woke up, sunlight filled the room, and for a moment I didn't remember where I was. Then it came back to me, not as a shock, but as something calm and certain. I had left. I had actually done it. I made breakfast slowly, without rushing, without trying to stay out of anyone's way. Dost, der. Simple things that somehow felt new. I sat by the window and watched the ocean stretch endlessly into the distance. It had been years since I had allowed myself to sit and do nothing. Not wait, not prepare, not anticipate, just be. I didn't realize how much of my life had been spent in quiet anticipation of someone else's needs until that moment. But reality doesn't disappear just because you change your surroundings. I knew it was coming. By evening, I checked the clock more often than I wanted to admit. Not out of fear, but expectation. Back at the house, they would have returned by now. They would have opened the door, called my name, waited for an answer that wouldn't come. I could almost see it. The confusion first, then the realization, then the anger. The envelope on the table. The words I had left behind. At exactly 7:18 p.m., my phone rang. I looked at it without touching it. Daniel. It rang until it stopped. Then again. And again. Soon, the messages started appearing, one after another, filling the screen faster than I could read them. Where are you? What is this?
Call me immediately.
Emily, this isn't funny. You can't just leave like this. I placed the phone face down on the table. The sound of the waves continued outside, steady and indifferent to everything happening in that other world I had stepped out of. For the first time, I didn't feel obligated to respond. That was new. That was powerful. After a while, the phone stopped ringing, only to start again minutes later. Claire's name appeared this time. I let it ring. I wasn't ready. Not to explain, not to defend myself, not to be pulled back into the same patterns I had just escaped. Instead, I walked to the balcony. The sky was painted in shades of orange and deep blue, the horizon glowing as the sun disappeared. The air smelled like salt and possibility. I rested my hands on the railing and allowed myself to breathe deeply, slowly, as if I were learning how to do it properly for the first time. Behind me, my phone continued its desperate rhythm. But out here, none of that could reach me. Not really. An hour later, I finally checked it. Dozens of missed calls. Messages growing more frantic, more emotional. Some angry, some pleading, some confused. One stood out more than the others. You owe us an explanation. I stared at that sentence for a long moment.
Oh.
That word followed me through most of my life. I owed patience. I owed sacrifice. I owed understanding. I owed forgiveness. But standing there, in my own space, with the ocean stretching endlessly in front of me, I realized something simple and undeniable. I didn't owe anyone my disappearance. I had earned it. I turned the phone to silent and placed it in a drawer. Tomorrow, would come soon enough. That night, I slept even better than the first. The following days unfolded slowly, like a life I had forgotten how to live. I explored the neighborhood one step at a time. A small cafe on the corner, where the owner smiled at me as if I mattered. A bookstore that smelled of paper and quiet thoughts. A narrow path along the shore where people walked without rushing, without purpose beyond simply being there. No one asked me what I could do for them. No one measured my value. People spoke to me because they wanted to, not because they needed something. It was unfamiliar, and yet it felt right. On the third day, I met my neighbor. She knocked lightly on my door, not impatient, not demanding, just present. When I opened it, she smiled warmly and introduced herself. There was no curiosity in her eyes, no hidden judgment, just simple kindness. "We're having a small gathering downstairs," she said. "Nothing formal, just some tea and conversation. You're welcome to join if you'd like." I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't want to go, but because I wasn't used to being invited without expectation. "I'd like that," I said finally. The room downstairs was filled with people around my age. Some laughing, some quietly talking, some simply listening. No one dominated the space. No one tried to impress anyone. It was balanced. I sat down, unsure at first, but slowly the tension in my shoulders eased. Conversations flowed naturally. I found myself speaking, not out of obligation, but because I had something to say. And people listened, not politely, not out of courtesy,
Genuinely.
That night, when I returned to my apartment, something inside me shifted again. A small but important realization settled in. I wasn't just escaping something. I was building something. Of course, the past didn't disappear entirely. By the end of the week, I turned my phone back on. The messages had slowed, but they hadn't stopped. Daniel's tone had changed, less anger, more confusion. Then concern. Claire's messages were shorter, colder, but even they had lost their sharp edge. I replied with only a few words. "I'm safe. I need time." Nothing more. The phone rang immediately after. I didn't answer. Instead, I placed it back down and looked around my apartment. The light coming through the window, the quiet, the sense of space that no one could take from me. For years, I had lived as if my life was something to be shared, adjusted, reduced to fit others. Now, for the first time, it was entirely mine. And that realization was both beautiful and terrifying. Because once you understand what freedom feels like, you can never go back to being invisible. A month passed before I truly noticed the change in myself. Not just in the way I lived, but in the way I thought, moved, even breathed. At first, everything had felt like a temporary escape, as if I had stepped outside my life for a moment and would eventually have to return to it. But as the days unfolded, one after another, a quiet truth settled in. I wasn't outside my life anymore. This was my life now. And for the first time in decades, it wasn't built around anyone else. My mornings became something I actually looked forward to. I would wake up without tension already sitting in my chest. No anticipation of complaints, no mental checklist of what needed to be done for others before I could even think about myself. I would make tea slowly, sometimes leaving it to steep longer than necessary, just because I could. I would sit by the window and watch the ocean, noticing how it was never the same twice. Some days calm, almost glass-like. Other days restless, alive, as if it carried stories I couldn't quite hear, but could somehow feel. My body still hurt. Age doesn't disappear just because your environment changes. But the pain felt different, lighter somehow. Or maybe it wasn't the pain that changed, but everything around it. Without constant stress pressing against me, my body didn't feel like it was fighting a battle all the time. I started moving more, walking longer distances, standing without rushing to sit down again. Even my hands, stiff and unreliable for so long, began to feel a little less like a burden. It was during one of those mornings that Sarah, my neighbor, convinced me to join her for a class at the community center. I resisted at first. The idea of trying something new felt unnecessary, even uncomfortable. For years, my role had been clearly defined. I didn't need hobbies. I didn't need activities. I needed to be available, useful, present for everyone else. That had been enough. But Sarah didn't push in the way I was used to. She simply said, "Come with me. If you don't like it, you can leave."
No expectations. No expectations.
That phrase stayed with me. So I went. The class was simple, gentle movement, slow breathing, guided balance. Nothing intense, nothing demanding. But it required something I hadn't practiced in years: attention to myself. Not to how I was perceived, not to what someone needed from me, but to what I felt in my own body. At first, it was frustrating. My balance wasn't steady. My movements felt awkward. I was aware of every limitation, every stiffness, every sign of age. But no one around me seemed to care. No one watched me with judgment. No one sighed or rolled their eyes or made subtle comments about how I was doing something wrong. They simply existed alongside me. And that, strangely, made it easier. By the end of the session, I wasn't perfect. Not even close. But I felt present. Grounded in a way I hadn't felt in years. As we walked out together, Sarah smiled at me like I had accomplished something significant. "You see," she said, "not so bad." I nodded, though the words didn't fully capture what I felt. It wasn't about the class. It was about realizing that I could still begin something new. That my life hadn't ended. It had just been paused. That afternoon, I sat in my apartment longer than usual, thinking about everything that had changed in such a short time. A month ago, I had been someone who measured her worth by how little space she took up. Now, I was slowly learning how to take space again, not loudly, not forcefully, but unapologetically. Of course, the past still reached for me. Daniel hadn't stopped trying to contact me, though the intensity had faded. His messages came less frequently now, but they carried a different tone. Less anger, more uncertainty. Sometimes even something that resembled regret. He asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, if we could talk. Claire, on the other hand, had gone silent. That silence didn't surprise me, but it did leave a question hanging in the background, one I wasn't ready to answer yet. I responded to Daniel occasionally, keeping my words short, careful. Not cold, but not inviting either. I wasn't ready to open that door fully. Not when I had just begun to understand what it meant to stand on my own. Weeks passed, and my life continued to grow in quiet ways. I found a small cafe where the owner remembered my order. I discovered a bench along the shore that became mine, a place where I could sit and think without interruption. I even started attending a small art class, something I would have laughed at before. Painting had never been part of my life. I had always told myself I wasn't creative, that I didn't have the patience or the talent. But sitting there with a brush in my hand, trying to capture the shifting colors of the water, I realized something unexpected. It wasn't about being good. It was about seeing. And I had always been good at seeing, just not when it came to myself. One afternoon, as I worked on a simple painting of the shoreline, the instructor paused beside me. She didn't correct me, didn't point out mistakes. She simply said, "You notice details most people miss." The comment stayed with me long after the class ended, because it was true. I had spent my entire life noticing things, what people needed, what they felt, what they didn't say. I had built my identity around that ability, but I had never turned it inward. I had never asked myself what I needed, what I felt, what I had been ignoring, until now. That realization didn't come with regret. Surprisingly, it came with a kind of quiet acceptance. I couldn't change the years behind me, but I could choose what to do with the ones ahead. And for the first time, those years felt like they belonged to me. Still, there were moments, small, unexpected ones, when doubt crept in. Late at night, when the apartment was too quiet, When I thought about my grandchildren and the way they used to run to me without hesitation. When I wondered if I had been too harsh, too final, too unwilling to explain. But then I would remember that dinner, that sentence, that silence, and the doubt would fade. Not completely, but enough. One evening, as I stood on the balcony watching the sun disappear into the horizon, my phone rang again. Daniel. I stared at the screen longer than usual this time. Something felt different. Not urgent. Not desperate. Just real. I answered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear his breathing on the other end, uneven, uncertain. "Mom," he said finally, his voice quieter than I remembered. "We need to talk." I didn't respond immediately. The ocean stretched out in front of me, steady, endless, reminding me that I wasn't standing in the same place anymore. "I'm listening," I said. "Not like this," he replied. "Not over the phone. Please."
I need to see you.
I closed my eyes briefly. A month ago, that request would have filled me with anxiety, with the automatic need to fix things, to smooth everything over. Now, it made me pause, because this time, the decision was mine. "I'll think about it," I said. And for the first time in my life, those words weren't a delay. They were a boundary. For 2 days after that call, I didn't give Daniel an answer. Not because I wanted to punish him, and not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand something first. I needed to be sure that if I agreed to see him, I wouldn't lose everything I had just begun to build. It's a strange thing, learning to protect yourself after a lifetime of putting others first. It doesn't come naturally. Every instinct still whispers that you should fix things, soften things, make it easier for everyone else. But I had learned, slowly and painfully, that making things easier for others had made me disappear. And I wasn't willing to disappear again. During those 2 days, I went through my routine as usual: morning tea, a walk along the shore, a short class at the community center, but everything felt slightly different, as if I were standing on the edge of something important. My thoughts kept circling back to him, not to the man he was now, but to the boy he used to be. The child who used to run toward me without hesitation, who believed I could fix anything. That memory was dangerous, I realized. Not because it was wrong, but because it could blur the truth of who he had become. On the 3rd day, I finally sent him a message. Friday, 2 p.m. A cafe by the water. Just you. His reply came almost immediately. "Thank you." That was all. Friday arrived with a kind of clarity that made everything feel sharper. I chose my clothes carefully, not to impress him, but to reflect who I was now. Not the version of myself that tried to be convenient, invisible, easy, but someone who took up space, even if only a little. When I looked in the mirror before leaving, I didn't see the same woman who had sat silently at that dinner table weeks ago. There was still softness in my face, still age, still the marks of everything I had lived through. But there was also something steadier behind my eyes. I arrived early. I wanted control over at least one part of this meeting. The cafe was quiet, filled with soft conversations and the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. I chose a table by the window where I could see the entrance. My hands rested calmly around a cup of tea, though I could feel a subtle tension in my chest, not fear, but anticipation. When I saw him walking toward the cafe, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller, not physically, but in a way that was harder to define. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his steps uncertain. There was a heaviness in the way he moved, as if something had shifted inside him too. For a brief moment, my heart tightened, but I didn't move. When he entered, his eyes found me immediately. He paused, just for a second, as if he wasn't sure how to approach me anymore. That hesitation told me more than anything he could have said. "Emily," he said when he reached the table. "Nah, Mom." "Emily." I noticed it, and I didn't correct him. "Sit," I said calmly. He did, glancing at me as if trying to read something in my expression. I didn't offer him anything, no smile, no reassurance. Not out of cruelty, but because I needed him to meet me where I was now, not where I used to be. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. You look different, he said finally. I am, I replied. That seemed to unsettle him more than I expected. He ordered coffee, though he barely touched it once it arrived. His attention kept returning to me, searching, uncertain. I didn't know if you would come, he admitted. I didn't know either, I said honestly. That seemed to open something in him. I've been thinking a lot, he began, his voice unsteady at first, but gaining strength as he continued. About everything. About that night. About how things were before that too. I didn't see it. I mean, I saw parts of it, but I didn't understand what it was doing to you. I listened without interrupting. That was something new too, not rushing to respond, not filling the silence, not helping him find the right words. He had to do that himself. I thought I was taking care of you, he continued. I thought giving you a place to live, making sure you didn't have to worry about money, that was enough. I didn't think about how you felt.
Not really.
No, I said quietly. You didn't. He flinched slightly, but he didn't argue. That night, he hesitated, running a hand through his hair. What Claire said, it was wrong.
I should have said something.
I should have stopped it. Yes, I said again. You should have. The simplicity of my answers seemed to affect him more than anger would have. I'm not here to fight with you, he said quickly. I need to understand. Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me how bad it was? I held his gaze steadily. Because I shouldn't have had to. That stopped him. You were there, I continued. You saw how I was treated. You heard the comments. You watched it happen over and over again. And you chose not to see it. That's different from not knowing. He looked down at the table, his expression tightening. I didn't think it was that serious, he said quietly. It was my life, I replied. The words hung between us, heavy but clear. We sat in silence for a moment after that. Outside, people walked along the shore, laughing, living, unaware of the quiet shift happening at our table. The house, he said after a while. Did you plan that for a long time? No, I said. I planned leaving. The rest became possible when I realized I still had a choice. And you didn't think about what would happen to us? I tilted my head slightly. I did. I just realized that for once, it wasn't the most important thing. That answer seemed to hit him harder than anything else I had said. We had to move, he said. We're staying with Claire's parents. It's not easy. I studied him for a moment. I imagine it isn't. There was no satisfaction in my voice.
No revenge.
Just acknowledgement. I miss you, he said suddenly. That caught me off guard, not because I didn't expect it, but because of how quietly he said it. Not as a demand, not as a way to pull me back, but as something real. For a moment, the old instinct rose in me, to soften, to comfort, to fix. But I held it back. I miss parts of you too, I said carefully. But missing someone doesn't fix what was broken. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. I'm not asking you to come back, he said. I know that's not going to happen. I want a chance to do better. To fix what I can. I didn't respond immediately. Because this was the moment that mattered. Not what he said, but what I chose. What does that look like? I asked finally. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I'm willing to try. I leaned back slightly, considering him. For the first time, I wasn't looking at him as my son. I was looking at him as a person. And I was deciding whether that person deserved a place in my life. You don't get the same version of me back, I said calmly. That person doesn't exist anymore. He nodded. I understand. You don't decide how this goes. I continued.
Ido.
Another nod. I know. I watched him for a moment longer, searching for something. Sincerity. Maybe. Effort.
Change.
I saw enough. Then we start slowly, I said. Carefully. Relief flickered across his face, but he didn't overreact. that, more than anything, told me he was beginning to understand.
Thank you, he said. I shook my head slightly.
This isn't forgiveness, I said. It's a beginning. And for the first time since that night, I felt something shift again. Not backward. Forward. After that meeting, nothing changed overnight, and that was exactly how it needed to be. In the past, everything in my life had shifted quickly, usually in response to someone else's needs, someone else's decisions. I had adapted, adjusted, bent myself into whatever shape was required to keep things functioning. But this time, there was no urgency, no pressure to fix everything at once. Whatever came next would happen slowly, and more importantly, it would happen on my terms. The first few days after seeing Daniel were quiet. I returned to my routine, but I noticed something different in myself. I wasn't replaying the conversation over and over, analyzing every word, questioning whether I had been too harsh or too distant. That used to be my habit, to take responsibility for everything, even things that were never mine to carry. But now I allowed the conversation to simply exist as it was. It had happened. It meant something. And that was enough. Daniel didn't call immediately, which I appreciated more than I expected. Instead, he sent a short message 2 days later. Thank you for meeting me. I'll wait until you're ready to talk again. There was no pressure in his words, no hidden demand. Just patience. That alone told me more than any apology could have. A week later, I agreed to see the children. That decision was harder than meeting Daniel. Not because I was afraid of them, but because I knew how much I had missed them and how easily that love could pull me back into old patterns if I wasn't careful. Children don't understand boundaries the way adults do. They love simply, directly, without conditions. And that kind of love can make you forget everything else if you let it. We met at a park near the water. I arrived early again, sitting on a bench where I could see the entrance. My hands rested calmly in my lap, but inside, there was a quiet storm of anticipation. When they appeared, I saw them before they saw me, running slightly ahead of Daniel, full of energy, unaware of the weight of the situation. Then my granddaughter spotted me. Grandma. She ran toward me without hesitation, her voice cutting through everything else. I barely had time to stand before she wrapped her arms around me, holding on tightly as if I might disappear again. And for a moment, everything inside me softened. I held her just as tightly, breathing in that familiar sense of connection I had missed more than I had allowed myself to admit. My grandson approached more slowly, studying me with curious eyes before stepping closer. You look different, he said. I smiled slightly. Do you like it? He nodded. You look happier. That simple observation stayed with me longer than anything else that day. We spent the afternoon together, walking, talking, laughing in a way that felt natural, not forced. They told me about school, their friends, the small details of their lives that I had been absent from. I listened carefully, fully present, not distracted by anything else. Daniel stayed nearby, but didn't interfere, allowing the space to belong to us. When it was time to leave, my granddaughter took my hand again. Are you coming back with us? She asked. The question was inevitable. I crouched down so I could look at her properly. This is my home now, I said gently. But that doesn't mean I'm gone. She frowned slightly, trying to understand. I'll see you again soon, I added. Promise. I promise. As they walked away, I felt the familiar ache return. But this time, it didn't come with helplessness. It came with choice. I wasn't losing them. I was redefining how they existed in my life. Over the following weeks, we built something new. Not what we had before, but something different. Something more honest. We met regularly, always outside the old house, always in spaces that didn't belong to the past. Parks, cafes, the shoreline. Places where I could remain myself, where I didn't have to step back into a role that no longer fit. Daniel changed too. Not perfectly, not instantly, but noticeably. He listened more. He spoke less. He asked questions and waited for answers instead of assuming them. There were moments when old habits surfaced, when he slipped into familiar patterns, but now I saw them clearly and, more importantly, I addressed them.
Calmly.
Directly. Without guilt. And he listened. That was the difference. Claire remained absent for a while, until one day she called. I stared at her name on the screen longer than I had with Daniel's. Her voice, her words, the way she had looked at me that night, it was all still there, unchanged in my memory. But something else had changed.
Me.
I answered. Her voice was different from what I remembered. Quieter. Less certain. Emily, she said, hesitating slightly. I was wondering if we could talk. There was a time when I would have agreed immediately, trying to smooth things over, to restore some version of peace. This time I paused.
Why?
I asked. She didn't expect that. I've been thinking, she said slowly, about everything, about how I treated you. I said nothing. I was wrong, she added. I didn't realize how much until after you left. The silence stretched between us. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she continued. I'd like the chance to speak to you in person. I considered her words carefully. Not what she said, but how she said it. I'll think about it, I replied. The same words I had once given Daniel. The same boundary. Days later, we met. Not in a familiar place. Not in a setting that gave either of us an advantage. Just a quiet cafe, neutral, open. She looked different too. Not physically, but in the way she carried herself. Less confident, less controlled. For the first time, she didn't feel like someone who had power over me. She felt human. I don't expect you to trust me, she said. I wouldn't if I were you. That's true, I replied. She nodded, accepting it. I grew up watching my mother treat her own mother the same way, she admitted after a moment. I thought it was normal. I didn't question it. When you came into our home, I just continued it. That didn't excuse anything, but it explained something. I'm trying to change that, she said. For the children. For myself. I studied her for a long moment. I won't be treated like that again. I said finally. You won't, she replied. This time, I believed she meant it. Not completely. Not blindly. But enough to allow a possibility. Months passed. Seasons changed. And with them, so did everything else. By the time winter arrived, my small apartment no longer felt temporary. It felt rooted. My routines had deepened into something stable, something real. I had people in my life who saw me, who valued me without conditions. I had space to think, to create, to exist without shrinking. And my family, they were still there. Not the same as before, but better in ways I hadn't thought possible. On a cold evening, we gathered in my apartment for the first time. It wasn't large, and we had to move things around to make space, but no one complained. The children laughed, filling the room with energy. Daniel helped without being asked. Claire moved carefully, respectfully, aware of every word, every action. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Later that night, after everyone had left, I stepped onto the balcony. The air was cold, sharp against my skin, but the ocean was steady as ever, moving, constant, endless. Daniel joined me quietly. I'm sorry, he said again. This time, I didn't respond with words right away. I looked out at the water, at the path it carved without asking permission, without stopping for anything in its way. I know, I said finally, and I did. But more importantly, I see myself now, I added. That was the difference. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Not even love. Awareness. I was no longer invisible. And I never would be again.